everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week, so if you think that's something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about a solved case from the northwest of England when a sweet and friendly elderly woman suddenly passed away after being trapped in a terrifying house fire. Initially, it was believed by the authorities that her death was just the result of a tragic accident. However, a year on from the event, and police were forced to revisit this theory following a report that an individual close to the deceased had been making claims that in fact this was no accident. Foul play was involved in her death. The blaze had been set intentionally, and when a new investigation was launched, now with the view that this was a homicide, police uncovered an abundance of truly chilling evidence, including the fact that the perpetrator in question had even confessed to committing murder during a game of truth or dare. Join me as we delve into the shocking case of Mary Gregory. But quickly before we get into the case, I would just like to say a big thank you to Ridge for very kindly sponsoring this section of the video. Ridge are a brand that makes high quality premium material wallets that are much more compact and minimalistic, making it so much easier for you to carry around the items that you need every single day. Because we've all had one. We've all had one of those wallets that are big and bulky and just take up so much room in your bag or in your pocket until they just kind of fall apart after a while. Well, Ridge wanted to change that by making better quality wallets that are more durable, but also that just look really good and really stylish. They offer a range of different colours and styles, including leather. They have carbon fibre wallets, and they have also recently launched their new lavender range, which is the wallet that I'm currently using, and I love it. It's so pretty. Safe to say you will definitely be able to find a wallet design on their website that suits you. Like I said, they are made from high quality premium materials such as titanium, aluminium and carbon fibre, which protects the contents of your wallet and makes them last way longer than other wallets. They can hold up to 12 cards, and yet they are still slim and compact, meaning that they will easily fit into your pockets and they won't take up much room in your bag. And what's great about Ridge is that their wallets are also customizable, as they offer different attachments which you can easily add and remove from your wallet whenever you want. So for example, they have an AirTag holder, they have a money clip, and they have a cash strap. I currently have the cash strap on my wallet. Their wallets come with RFID blocking materials, ensuring that your personal information is kept safe and secure. And Ridge don't just sell wallets actually. They also sell key cases, which again are designed to stop your keys from taking up unnecessary space. It keeps them slim and compact, it stops them from jingling around in your pockets, and it can hold anywhere from 1 to 6 keys. And you can actually get a key case to match your wallet too, which is just amazing. I really could not recommend Ridge's products enough, so if you would like to check them out for yourself, treat yourself or someone else to a brand new wallet, then this is the perfect opportunity to do so, because right now, just in time for Mother's Day, Ridge are offering up to 30% off their new lavender collection. And if you go through my link in the description box and you use my discount code, which is just Mollie, then you will receive an additional 10% off non-discounted items. And using my discount code really does help out this channel, because it lets the team over at Ridge know that you have ordered through me as a result of this video. Thank you so much once again to Ridge for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you to all of you guys watching for always showing your support to the sponsors that we work with on this channel. And now let's just get into the case. But just before we continue, please listen carefully to the following. This video contains heavy themes such as mental health issues like depression, anxiety and suicidal thoughts. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back just under 7 years ago now to the summer of 2018 in Heysham, which is a little coastal village located in the county of Lancashire in the northwest of England. And this is Mary Gregory. She was an elderly woman who lived in Heysham. Specifically, Mary lived in a little bungalow on a road called Levens Drive in Heysham. So just for a bit about Mary, she was 94 years old at the time that this case occurred, soon approaching her 95th birthday actually. She lived on her own, as I believe she was a widow. However, she did have 2 adult sons, one of whom lived close by to Mary, also in Heysham. That was Christopher, the son who lived close by to Mary, and then she also had another son named Peter, and he lived in London. And Christopher and Peter had children of their own, so Mary was also a grandmother, a much loved mother and grandmother. Years earlier, she also used to be a school teacher. That was her career, which she absolutely loved, but of course she was retired by this point. And to be honest, everyone that knew Mary just thought of her as being such a sweet and caring and lovely woman. She was very sociable. She loved chatting to her neighbours on Levens Drive. She loved spending time outside in her garden. Her neighbours would often see her smoking a cigarette in her garden, and she would joke with her neighbours saying that she would only have one cigarette a day, but her neighbours knew that she would actually have a lot more than that. She was quite a heavy smoker, was Mary Gregory. Although she did live on her own, she was said to have still been very independent. However, she did sadly suffer with dementia, and apparently she could get quite confused sometimes. So although she did enjoy her own company, did enjoy her independence, she did also have some assistants. Her son Christopher would often pop in to check on his mum, do things for her, as he did live close by. And in addition to that, she would also have carers come by every day to help her with certain tasks, you know, like cooking and cleaning and stuff like that. And also just for someone to chat to. She had one particular carer who would go round most days. Her name was Carolina, and she said that she and Mary would often enjoy just putting the kettle on, making a cup of tea and just sitting down and having a chat. Carolina actually said in a documentary that I watched about this case that Mary Gregory was always one of her favourite clients. She always looked forward to going around and seeing Mary because she was just always so nice and so lovely, and she loved hearing about Mary's life and the stories that she had to tell. Mary would always chat to Carolina and her carers about her family, her children and her grandchildren. It was clear just how much she doted on them. I mean, like I said before, Mary Gregory was a much loved mother and grandmother, and aside from the fact that she was suffering from dementia, she was actually in pretty good health. For a 94-year-old woman, she was doing well. That was until mid-2018, when the lives of the Gregory family changed forever, and in the most heartbreaking way, following a tragic and terrifying event that happened in Mary's home on Levens Drive. It was the early hours of the morning, around 4 a.m. on the 28th of May 2018, when neighbours were awoken by the smell of smoke and the sound of a woman shouting, help me," over and over again. That woman was Mary Gregory, and the smell of smoke was coming from her bungalow on Levens Drive. Mary's house was on fire, engulfed by flames, and Mary was clearly trapped inside. So neighbours immediately rang the emergency services, rang 999, and they were warned not to approach the house, not to try and go inside themselves because it was far too dangerous. Neighbours could actually feel the heat from the flames just from standing outside of the property. Fire engines were quickly dispatched to the scene. They were on Levens Drive within 10 minutes of receiving the call, and firefighters immediately made their way inside the bungalow to try and save Mary. And they actually found her huddled underneath a table in her conservatory. She'd hidden under there in an effort to obviously keep away from the fire and the smoke as best she could. She was carried out by the firefighters, and she was actually still conscious. As she was being brought out, she was trying to cough and trying to speak, but I mean, she was in a very, very bad way. She had inhaled a lot of smoke. I actually came across one article which said that the inside of her mouth was just completely black from the amount of smoke that she had inhaled. And so she was immediately taken to the hospital, and her family were informed about what had happened, that Mary had been stuck in a house fire and that she was now in the hospital fighting for her life. Once she arrived at the hospital, she was put on a ventilator to help with her breathing, and her heartbroken family, her sons and her grandkids, would be by her bedside every single day, just praying that she would pull through this and that she would be okay. But tragically, over the coming days, Mary's condition just deteriorated. The smoke inhalation was something that her little frail body just couldn't withstand. And just 4 days after the fire, on the 1st of June 2018, 94-year-old Mary Gregory tragically passed away in hospital as a result of her injuries. Now, of course, following Mary's death, given the circumstances of her death, an investigation had to be launched by the authorities to establish how this had happened. How Mary's bungalow had caught on fire that night. Was this just a tragic accident, or had something more sinister occurred? Was this arson? Was foul play involved here? So fire investigators were sent into the property. They took a look around, took a load of photographs, and ultimately their conclusion of this inquest was that, yeah, yes, this was just a terrible accident. As we know, Mary Gregory was a smoker. She smoked cigarettes every single day. She also suffered with dementia. So it seemed very likely that the fire had started by a dropped or discarded cigarette that Mary obviously thought she had put out, but in fact hadn't. She just hadn't realised that her cigarette was still alight, and that was what ignited the flames. And that was that. Case closed, I guess. Mary's family had to deal with the sudden loss of her, cope with the heartbreaking thoughts and visions of her being trapped in the house on her own, and the memories of her fighting for her life in the hospital. It was awful for them, as you can imagine, losing her in such a tragic way. However, they were completely unaware that everything they thought they knew about Mary's death was actually not the reality of the situation. As about a year on from this terrible event, authorities were confronted with the bombshell that in fact the fire in Mary's home may not have been all that it seemed, may not have been an accident after all. You see, 12 months on from this case, in May of 2019, Lancashire police were contacted by a member of the public, a woman who actually worked as a counsellor, a mental health counsellor, and she had some very interesting information to share with them. She told the police that one of her clients was this teenage boy named Darnton. He was a local boy, a local college student. He was 18 years old, so he would have been 17 the year earlier, back in May of 2018, and he was having counselling for his mental health issues. Apparently he suffered with anxiety and depression and suicidal thoughts. It was also thought that he may have been on the autistic spectrum too. He had a neurodevelopmental condition. So he had been having counselling sessions for some time, but the reason his counsellor felt that she needed to contact the police was because during one of their sessions, Darnton had actually confessed to her that he had killed someone. He had committed murder. How this kind of came about was basically Tiernan started making comments to his counsellor about how he had a friend who knew something about him that could send Tiernan to prison for a very long time. He'd confessed something to a friend that could result in him going to prison. So the counsellor began trying to ask him questions about this. What had he told his friend that could lead to him going to prison? But initially it was clear that Tiernan Darnton was very kind of reluctant to elaborate further. He was described as being very cryptic and non-specific. He wasn't really making much sense, to be honest, but the counsellor kept pressing him, kept asking him questions, encouraging him to open up, and eventually he did, and he informed his counsellor that, yeah, he had murdered someone. Now, from what I can gather, he didn't tell the counsellor in that same conversation who it was that he had supposedly murdered. He just confessed that he had killed someone. And so, to try and get to the bottom of this, the counsellor asked for Tiernan Darnton's stepfather, who he was very close to come in and join them in their next session. I guess to see if perhaps Tiernan would divulge more information in his presence, as his stepfather was someone that he trusted. So the three of them sat down together, and the counsellor started bringing up what Tiernan had disclosed to her in their previous session, and she encouraged him to share his secret with his stepdad too. And interestingly, before anything more was really said, I think before the word murder was even mentioned, Tiernan's stepdad suddenly said, quote, "Is this about my mother?" To which Tiernan Darnton responded, yes. He was confessing to having been responsible for the death of his stepfather's mother. It turns out that Tiernan Darnton's stepfather was Christopher Gregory, one of the sons of Mary Gregory, who, as we know, died just the year prior following her house going up in flames as the result of a tragic accident. Or so everyone thought. Tiernan Darnton was Mary's step-grandson, I suppose. You see, he never really had a relationship with his biological father, I don't believe. And Mary's son, Christopher Gregory, used to be in a relationship with Tiernan's mother, during which he developed a very close bond with her son Tiernan. And Chris became that father figure in Tiernan's life. He kind of idolised his stepfather. So much so that when his mother and Chris eventually split up, he actually became close closer to Chris than he was to his own mother. Apparently, Tiernan Darnton and his mother would argue quite a lot, have frequent disagreements due to Tiernan's misbehaviour and just the fact that he would act out a lot. And so by the time this case occurred, rather than living with his mother, Tiernan was living in a house with his stepdad Chris. And I believe Chris was the one who was paying for Tiernan's counselling sessions, and as we know, it was during one of these sessions that Tiernan confessed to killing his stepfather's mother, Mary Gregory. As discussed, the counsellor brought in Tiernan's stepdad Chris to encourage Tiernan Darnton to open up more about this confession, and like I mentioned, before Tiernan could really say much more, Chris Gregory almost interrupted and said, "Is this about my mother?" I mean, it almost seemed like Christopher already knew what the counsellor was talking about. It almost seemed like he already had his own suspicions about his stepson's involvement in his mother's death. Had Tiernan already confessed to him that he had a part in it prior to this, perhaps? Tiernan Darnton was confessing to his stepfather Christopher and the counsellor that actually the authorities had gotten it wrong. The fire that killed Christopher's mother Mary hadn't started as the result of her accidentally dropping a still-lit cigarette. He had in fact started the fire that night by setting fire to some of the curtains in her home. He was the one who caused her death. Now, of course, upon hearing this revelation, the counsellor informed Tiernan and Chris that she had an obligation to report this to the police. She had to contact the police about what Tiernan had told them. However, would you believe it, Christopher Gregory actually told her not to. She couldn't do that. The case had already been closed, it had already been ruled as accidental, and he didn't want the police raking this all back up because he was worried that if his stepson Tiernan went to prison, he would not cope. Tiernan wouldn't survive, which, I mean, is wild, isn't it? His stepson was openly admitting that he'd killed Chris's own mother in front of him and his counsellor, and instead of being furious and heartbroken and wanting Tiernan to face punishment for what he had done, Chris was instead essentially pleading with Tiernan's counsellor not to tell the police about this. He didn't want Tiernan to get into trouble, but as we know, she did anyway. A year after the fire, in May of 2019, the counsellor contacted the Lancashire police and she told them everything, forcing the authorities to question if they had in fact made a mistake, if they were incorrect in their conclusion that Mary's death was an accident, when in reality she had been the victim of a horrific homicide at the hands of her own grandchild or step-grandchild. I mean, you know, Tiernan Darnton was having counselling because he had mental health issues. There could always be a strong chance that he was, I guess, just so mentally ill that he was lying about this. For some reason, confessing to a crime that he didn't commit, but of course the police had to investigate these claims nevertheless and get to the bottom of this. And so he was arrested. 18-year-old Tiernan Darnton was arrested at his home in Haitian, the home where he lived with his stepfather, and he was taken into custody. He was soon assigned a lawyer, and when detectives went to question him, he pretty much responded with no comment to every single question that he was asked. However, he did give over a prepared statement that he'd written alongside his lawyer, and in this statement, he admitted that, yes, okay, he had told his counsellor that he was responsible for the death of Mary Gregory. He had told her that he set alight some curtains in her home that night and that that was what started the fire. But he was now claiming exactly what I just said, that this was a lie. He had mental health struggles and therefore he couldn't really understand the gravity of what he'd said, I suppose. But it wasn't true. He didn't kill Mary, and he even said that he had no reason to want Mary dead. He liked his step-grandmother. He had a good relationship with her. However, upon conducting a thorough search of the house where Darnton lived, the police, well, they just didn't believe this story, this statement for 1 minute, to be honest. They found several items in his home that suggested that actually there was truth behind his confession to his counsellor. Of course, the police searched the entire house from top to bottom, but their main focus was Tiernan Darnton's bedroom, and in there they discovered what appeared to be pretty incriminating evidence. They found this notebook, and interestingly, on one of the pages of this notebook, there appeared to be this sketch of the floor plan of a house or bungalow Mary's bungalow. On the same page, he'd made notes about where some of Mary's possessions were kept in the bungalow, like her jewellery, her money, her house keys, the remote control to the garage, and he'd made a note of every single entrance and exit to the property. He'd also written on this page things like, quote, easy access and good hiding place, and doorway is a good distraction, good alibi. I mean, it seems obvious, doesn't it, what this sketch was for? It was for Tien and Darnton to essentially plan, organise how he was going to carry out Mary's murder. He'd obviously drawn out this floor plan prior to Mary's death, indicating that the fire at Mary's house was premeditated. He'd been carefully planning Mary's murder for some time before that fateful night back in May of 2018. And he didn't even get rid of this floor plan after he committed the crime. The police found it in his bedroom a whole year after Mary died in that notebook. For some reason, he just kept it in his bedroom, and that wasn't all that he'd kept. They also found, I believe on another page in the same notebook, this list that Tien and Darnton had written, which he titled his kill list, which was exactly what you would imagine. It was a list of people that he apparently wanted to kill for some reason. Now, Mary's name wasn't actually on this list, but regardless, this just shows you the kind of mindset that Tien and Darnton had. Shows that he was thinking about committing murder, multiple murders, in fact, according to this list. And police soon realised that a couple of the people on Darnton's kill list was actually some of his own friends. Now, Tien and Darnton didn't really have that many friends. He'd always been a bit of a loner growing up. He was actually homeschooled for most of his childhood, I believe, until his teens when he went off to college. He always struggled to fit in socially with kids his age, but by the time he was 17, he did have some friends and acquaintances, I think from college. And like I said, a couple of his so-called friends were on his list of people that he apparently wanted dead. So the police went to speak to these friends. Thankfully, they hadn't come to any harm at the hands of Darnton, and the statements that two of them in particular provided the police would prove to be hugely significant in the investigation. You see, it transpires that the counsellor wasn't the only person that Darnton had confessed Mary's murder to. These two friends told the police that just a month or two after Mary's death in July of 2018, and only a couple of weeks after her funeral, he'd confessed to them too. In fact, he'd actually confessed during a game of Truth or Dare. They were just hanging out, I think having a few drinks, playing Truth or Dare as teenagers do, during which Tien and Darnton said to his two friends, quote, I have a secret that I haven't told anyone. I may have killed someone. Tien and Darnton's truth, his dark secret, was that his step-grandma's death wasn't actually a tragic accident as everyone believed. He'd managed to trick everyone because actually it was him that had set the fire. And sickeningly, he actually told these friends that the reason he did it, the reason he decided to kill Mary, was to essentially put her out of her misery. He knew that she was suffering from dementia and that she got confused sometimes, and he didn't want her to suffer anymore, and so he decided to just end her life like she was an animal or something that he just decided to put down, because apparently trapping an innocent elderly lady in a terrifying house fire is kinder than letting her struggle with dementia in his mind. Now, the friends never went to the police about this confession because, in all honesty, they didn't believe it for 1 minute. They just thought that Tien was lying, that he was making it up. It was some kind of sick joke. They never believed that he had actually done that, and so they didn't think that they needed to report this to the authorities. But, of course, when the police learned about this over a year later, when a new investigation into the death of Mary Gregory was opened, it was just more evidence against him. The fact that he'd confessed to not just one, but 3 people now. However, having said that, these confessions from Tien and Darnton were in essence just circumstantial evidence. The police knew that they would need much more concrete proof directly linking him to the crime if they were going to charge and subsequently prosecute him. I mean, they needed to actually prove that a crime had had even taken place here, because as we know, for the past year, this whole case had been treated as accidental. Mary Gregory had died as the result of a tragic accident because of a mistake that she had made, leaving a cigarette alight. But now the police needed to prove that no, that was incorrect. This was in fact a murder. So due to a lack of evidence, the police had to release Tien and Darnton from custody whilst they continued with building a case against him. The new investigation into Mary Gregory's death was officially launched. It was actually given the name Operation Ellsworth, and all hands were on deck. The team had 30 police officers in total, all working on this one case, officers from all over Lancashire, because the thing was, the detectives knew that this was going to be an incredibly tricky case because of the fact that it had been well over a year since Mary's death. They didn't have the crime scene anymore. Mary's house had, I think, been sold by this point, so they weren't going to be able to get any evidence in the way of like DNA or forensic. The chances of there being any witnesses a year on are relatively unlikely because, of course, people's memories fade over time. Things like CCTV footage wouldn't be an option because that would have been automatically deleted, I imagine, a year on. So yeah, the police knew that this was going to be a hard case to prove. But anyway, Operation Ellsworth was launched, and one of the police's inquiries involved delving into Tien and Darnton's electronic devices. Of course, his electronics, like his phone and his laptop, were seized during the search of his home. So the police started looking through the records on those, specifically his internet search history. They actually looked right back to before this case had even occurred, before the fire, to see what kind of things Darnton had been Googling both prior to the fire and since the fire. And sure enough, his Google search history was incredibly incriminating. They discovered that just the month before the house fire, in April of 2018, Darnton had Googled things like, quote, under 18 murder and I want to cause evil and how long do murderers serve in prison. The month after the fire, in June of 2018, there were more incriminating searches. He typed into Google, quote, I think I might be turning into a serial killer, please help. And also, urge to kill again, I am a murderer. And again, this was just the month after Mary's death. So this kind of indirectly tied him to the killing in a way. I believe his internet search history just kind of showed his obsession with murder and true crime in general, which, I mean, is not an uncommon interest to have, is it? I have an entire YouTube channel dedicated to the topic. But for Tien and Darnton, I mean, he took this way further than a normal healthy interest. Like I said, he seemed to be obsessed with murder and serial killers, almost like he idolized them. He looked up to them. Apparently, he also had an obsession with the Nazis. According to an old childhood friend of Darnton's, he had an armband that he would wear which had a swastika symbol on it. He also had this SS uniform and he would dress up as a Nazi. He had this dagger which I think had SS written on it. Now, again, none of this was necessarily concrete evidence directly connecting him to the crime, but it was additional circumstantial evidence that was helping to build the case more and more. Although it still wasn't enough. Again, the police needed more. Ideally, what they needed was evidence which put Tien and Darnton at the scene of the crime, at the scene of the fire on the night in question, the 28th of May 2018. However, again, this was going to be tricky because it was over a year on. The police didn't have the crime scene anymore. All they really had was images of the scene, pictures of Mary's bungalow which had been taken by investigators in the immediate aftermath of the fire. So could they potentially offer up anything in the way of evidence? Well, to find out, the detectives got out these pictures, they started flicking through them, and interestingly, they did come across some photographs which had been taken from Mary Gregory's care logbook. As I mentioned earlier on in the video, Mary had carers come to visit her every single day to help her with everyday tasks and just for someone to chat to. And during every single one of their visits, the carers would have to write down some notes about the visit in the care logbook, just like whether Mary had eaten, whether she drank much, if she was having any problems, etc, etc. Now, luckily, this care logbook hadn't really been destroyed by the fire, and there were pictures of the entry from the day before the fire at Mary's bungalow. So the 27th of May 2018, obviously the fire was in the early hours of the 28th of May. The logbook showed that the carer who visited Mary that day was Carolina. She'd actually popped in to see Mary 3 times on the 27th. Once in the morning, once around midday, and then the last time she visited Mary was in the evening, sometime around 6:30 to 7 p.m. So the police spoke to Carolina about what she could recall from these visits, and she actually informed them that when she went round to Mary's address, I believe the 3rd time that day in the evening, Mary wasn't alone in the bungalow. Also in there with her was the police's now top suspect, Darnton, her step-grandson. And in fact, it was very, very clear that Mary did not want Tiernan there. Carolina recalled how when she arrived, the two of them, Mary and Tiernan, were actually arguing in the conservatory. You see, Mary and Tiernan did not have a very good relationship at all. In his initial interview, when Tiernan denied starting the fire, he basically made out like he had no reason to want to kill his step-grandma because he liked her, they got along well. But in truth, well, that couldn't be further from the truth. Mary did not like Tiernan at all. She actually referred to him as the boy. She wouldn't really call him by his name, she would just call him the boy. And she just thought that he was really, really rude. I think he would just turn up to Mary's house unannounced and let himself in. He would help himself to Mary's food without asking. He would make a mess in her house and not clean it up. And she just thought that he was really disrespectful, to be honest, because he would just take advantage of her, and she used to get really upset about it. And that is exactly what happened the day before the fire. Once again, Tiernan just turned up unannounced, I believe, being really untidy, helping himself to Mary's food, and this sparked an argument between them, which, like I said, the carer Carolina witnessed when she arrived at the address. And this argument actually got so intense to the point where Carolina kind of had to step in and separate them and calm Mary down because she was just so angry and upset with Tiernan. So obviously that was very significant in the police's inquiries because it showed that Darnton had been to Mary's bungalow the day before the crime and he'd argued with her. Maybe he was so mad as a result of this argument that it encouraged him to do what the police now believed he'd gone on to do, start the fire in her bungalow later that night and trap her inside. But as well as the logbook records, there were also several other things that appeared to stand out to the police about the crime scene photographs. Things that didn't add up for this to have been an accidental fire. So firstly, one thing that they observed from the photographs was that the smoke alarms in Mary's bungalow had been removed from her ceilings. She had 3 smoke alarms in her house and every single one appeared to have been taken down and actually hidden around the house. I think the authorities found one hidden inside of a cupboard, there was another one hidden on top of a cupboard, and they could tell that they had been removed prior to the fire because the smoke alarm that was on top of the cupboard actually had a clean mark underneath. It wasn't, you know, covered in soot or smoke, so yeah, they had to have been taken down and put there before the fire started. And according to Mary's carers, usually the smoke alarms in Mary's bungalow were always where they were supposed to be, always fixed on the ceiling and switched on. So this indicated that they had to have been removed after Carolina the carer left on the evening of the 27th of May, but before the fire started in the early hours of the 28th. We know that Mary couldn't have done that herself because, well, number one, she was a tiny, frail, 94-year-old woman. She wouldn't have been able to reach up to the ceilings to remove these smoke alarms, but also she would have no reason to do that, would she? So someone else must have done it, most likely Darnton. It seemed clear that he'd taken down these smoke alarms so that Mary wouldn't be alerted that there was a fire in her property, and therefore she'd have less chance of escape and less chance of survival. I do question why that alone wasn't a huge red flag for the authorities immediately back when Mary died. Like, you'd think the smoke alarms having been disconnected and hidden in her house would have been a big indicator that this wasn't an accidental death and that foul play must have been involved, but anyway, carrying on. In addition to the smoke alarms being removed, police also noticed from the photographs that in Mary's hallway, the wire from her telephone had actually been pulled out of the socket. The phone wasn't plugged in and therefore couldn't be used. Again, indicating that that had been done on purpose so that Mary wouldn't have been able to call 999 for help. A coffee table from the home looked as though it had been moved and placed right in front of the doors in the conservatory, the doors which exited out to Mary's back garden, essentially blocking off one of the main exits of the bungalow. Again, Mary was a frail, elderly woman. She wouldn't have been able to move this coffee table herself. And Carolina informed the detectives that when she left Mary's bungalow the last time, the evening before the fire, that coffee table was not blocking the conservatory door. It was actually from another room in the property, so it had been moved after Carolina had left, clearly, again, to make it harder for Mary to escape the burning bungalow later that night. Mary also usually had a key kept in the door on the inside of the conservatory door to unlock it, and the crime scene photo showed that that was just suddenly gone. It was missing, so it seemed as though it had been taken. She also had a key safe on the outside of her bungalow, and I think usually it was the front door key that was kept in there for Mary's carers. Well, when forensics arrived after the fire, the key safe was open, and again, this key was gone also. It also appeared to have been taken by someone. And only the people closest to Mary, like her carers and her family members, knew the code for this key safe. Her son, Christopher Gregory, would have known the code, and so it's likely that his stepson, Darnton, knew the code as well. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in the months leading up to Mary's death, Darnton would often just turn up to Mary's house unannounced and let himself in, hence why she couldn't stand him, quite honestly. And according to a couple of articles, his stepfather, Christopher, had actually given Tiernan a set of keys to his mother's bungalow to allow Tiernan to do this, to just let himself in. Despite the fact that Mary didn't like Tiernan, and she made that very, very clear to her family, to her son Chris still allowed Tiernan access to these keys and allowed him to just come and go as he pleased, it seemed. And I know I briefly touched on this earlier, but again, something that really, really baffled people about this case was the fact that Christopher Gregory, for some reason, seemed to remain very loyal to his stepson throughout the investigation, even as the evidence was starting to build against Darnton, evidence which clearly proved that he had done this. He had set the fire. He had caused the death of his own stepfather's mother. Chris still refused to almost accept it, refused to turn his back on his stepson despite what he had very clearly done, despite the fact that Tiernan had killed his own mother. And it's not known why Christopher Gregory kind of refuses to accept reality, accept that his stepson is a murderer. Perhaps it's out of shame or out of embarrassment. He doesn't want to admit to himself, let alone anyone else, that Tiernan had killed his mum, and that he, in a way, almost made it easier for him to do this by allowing him access to the keys. I don't know. Now, in addition to the crime scene photos, police also obtained some additional evidence, additional information from both a neighbour of Mary's and a local milk delivery man. So firstly, the neighbour was able to tell the detectives that in the early hours of the morning, around 1 a.m. on the 28th of May 2018, she recalled looking out of her window across to Mary's bungalow, and oddly she noticed that the lights in Mary's bungalow were turned on and that the door to her garage was open, which she thought was really strange because obviously it was so late at night. This neighbour was actually really close to Mary. They were good friends, and so this made her worry a little, so worried that she decided to pick up the phone and actually call Mary's son Christopher to notify him of this, who, as we know, lived close by. She rang Christopher's house phone, however it wasn't Chris who picked up the phone, it was his stepson Darnton. So although Tiernan had been at Mary's address hours earlier when Carolina the carer went round, this statement from the neighbour proved that he was back at his house by 1 a.m. on the 28th. Apparently Chris Gregory was actually away that weekend. He wasn't at home, it was just Tiernan at home. So the neighbour spoke to Tiernan. She told him about the light being on and the garage door being open at Mary's house. And so Tiernan told this neighbour that he would pop by to Mary's bungalow the following day to check on her. Now, the fire at Mary's obviously hadn't started by 1 a.m. As we know, neighbours didn't call 999 until about 3 hours later, shortly after 4 a.m. Again, to reiterate, we know from this statement that Tiernan was at his own address at 1 o'clock, so now the police had to somehow prove that he'd gone back to Mary's at some point between 1 and 4 to start the fire. Well, when they spoke to the milkman who was doing the local milk delivery around Mary's area on the night of the 28th, he informed the police that at around 3:15 a.m. he passed by Mary's house. Again, the fire fire hadn't started by this point, and whilst the garage door to her bungalow was still open, the lights were now switched off. So at 1 a.m, the lights were on. By 3:15 a.m, they'd been turned off. Could have possibly been Mary herself. She could have turned off the light, but police were thinking that it was more likely Tiernan Darnton that switched off the lights whilst Mary was sleeping. After he received that call from Mary's neighbour, he headed back to her address in the early hours and turned the lights off, and he must have shut the garage door sometime after 3:15 and before the firefighters arrived an hour later, because by the time the fire service arrived, the garage door was shut and it hadn't been shut by then. However, I sound like a broken record at this point, but again, none of this was evidence directly putting Tiernan Darnton at the scene of the crime at the time that the fire started. It was still just kind of circumstantial, or at least that was until the detectives made yet another interesting observation from the crime scene photograph. So going back to the pictures, another one that was taken was actually of the rubbish bin in Mary's kitchen. The crime scene photographer even took a picture of the inside of the rubbish bin, and inside this bin you could see things like an empty tin of soup, which according to Carolina, the carer, Mary had eaten that day. She'd cooked it for Mary and she'd written this down in her logbook. Carolina also said that Tiernan Darnton had made himself food whilst he was there, as he often did, the remnants of which were also in the bin, like bread and stuff. However, what seemed significant to the police was that right at the very top of this rubbish bin was a plastic bag from a local garage or convenience store. It was only about an 8-minute walk from Mary's address. It was literally just round the corner. And inside of this plastic bag was both an empty can of Coca-Cola and also some wrappers of Tunnock's chocolate tea cakes. Now, the police knew that these hadn't come from Mary because she didn't drink Coca-Cola and she didn't eat chocolate tea cakes. And I believe Carolina, the carer, said that that plastic bag containing the Coca-Cola and the tea cake wrappers wasn't in there when she left Mary's bungalow for the last time on the evening of the 27th. So police wondered if they had come from Tiernan Darnton, from where he must have returned to the house in the early hours to start the fire. Apparently, he often drank Coca-Cola and ate these tea cakes, so could they somehow prove that he had to have been the one who left them in the bin, thus proving that he was back at the house in the early hours of the 28th, around the time that the fire had started? Well, like I said, police were able to determine that the plastic carrier bag containing the Coke can and chocolate wrappers was from a nearby garage. So they went to this garage, they spoke to the people who worked there, and of course by this point the CCTV from May of 2018 was gone. It had been automatically deleted as it was well over a year later, but thankfully what the garage did still have on their till or cash register's computer system was a record of all of the sales and transactions that had been made. They even still had their records of the sales made on the night of the fire, the 28th of May 2018. And upon delving into these records, the police were able to see that I believe shortly after 2 a.m. there was a sale of some Tunnock's chocolate tea cakes and also a can of Coca-Cola, the exact items that were found at the top of Mary's bin. So in the police's eyes, this was significant. This did kind of put Tiernan Darnton at the scene of the crime shortly before the fire had been set, because it was after he'd received that call from the neighbour at 1 a.m. about Mary's light being on and the garage door being open, and before the milkman passed by at 3:15 a.m. and said that the light was now off. I mean, it wasn't the most rock solid evidence, don't get me wrong, the police knew that, but for over a year on, I think they knew that it was the best they were probably going to get, and they had gathered a lot of evidence by this point. Yes, it was all mostly circumstantial, but all put together, it painted a pretty clear picture of the true circumstances surrounding Mary's death, from the crime scene photos, the statements from the neighbour and the milkman and Carolina, the fact that Darnton and Mary had argued the day before, the incriminating Google searches Darnton had made, his kill list, his sketch of the floor plan of Mary's house, his confessions not just to his counsellor but also his two friends during the game of Truth or Dare. Again, mostly circumstantial evidence, but all put together, it presented a pretty strong case against against him that proved he had gone to Mary Gregory's address in the early hours of the 28th of May, set fire to her curtains, watched her home go up in flames, and he did everything that he could to prevent Mary from getting out, making sure that she was trapped inside, such as removing the smoke alarms, unplugging the telephone, and blocking off the conservatory door. The police felt that they finally had a strong enough case to arrest him once again and charge him with murder. And so that's exactly what they did. Tian and Darnton went to trial at Preston Crown Court about 3 years or so after the crime in November of 2021, by which point he was around 21 years old and he chose to plead not guilty. During the trial, he took to the stand in his own defence, still claiming that he was innocent. I would imagine that the defence probably tried to take the angle of, again, the only reason he gave the false confessions was due to his mental health struggles, because he was so mentally ill. And whilst it was accepted during the trial that yes, he did suffer from depression and anxiety and he had suicidal thoughts, he wasn't so mentally unfit that he couldn't, I guess, comprehend what he was saying. There was no evidence of any psychosis or anything like that, nothing which could suggest that he couldn't be held accountable for his actions. According to court documents, actually, during the trial, both Tian and Darnton and his stepfather, Christopher Gregory, tried to portray Tianan's counsellor as a liar. They claimed that she was lying about Tianan having confessed to starting the fire and committing the murder. Again, Christopher was still standing by his stepson despite all of the evidence, but the jury were able to see through the lies, and at the end of the trial, Tian and Darnton was found guilty. The jury announced that they had found him guilty of the murder of 94-year-old Mary Gregory, and at his sentencing he received life in prison with a minimum of 15 years, so he will have to serve at least 15 years before he is even considered for parole. You may be thinking that 15 years is quite low, but you have to remember that his age would have been taken into account. He was 17 when he killed Mary, so technically he was a minor in the eyes of the law. During Darnton's sentencing, one of Mary Gregory's sons, Peter Gregory, gave a victim impact statement, so I'll read some quotes from that now. Peter said, "My poor mum had suffered such horrendous smoke inhalation that even after being bathed by the nurses, she still had smoke damage on her skin and hair, and the whole of the inside of her mouth was black. Watching her try to speak, choking on her words, was truly awful. That is a memory I will never erase from my mind, nor will I ever forget the vile cruelty she was subjected to. The images of her in her final days haunt me. Mum's death hit my whole family extremely hard. She was in reasonable health for a lady of almost 95, and I believe she would still be here with us today if Darnton had not killed her. Losing a parent is always hard, but when they are taken from you by such a callous act, it is simply heartbreaking. My 3 children lost a dearly loved, kind and caring grandmother, and my wife, a close friend and mother-in-law." Peter Gregory also criticised his own brother, Christopher Gregory, during his statement, not only for standing by Tian and Darnton despite what he had done, but for almost, in a way, enabling his awful behaviour towards their mother in the lead up to her death. He said, "Having learnt that my mum's death was at the hands of Tian and Darnton, whom he had willingly welcomed into our family home, is disgusting and shattering. He was frequently in mum's house in the final months leading to mum's death. She despised him and distrusted him and did not want him anywhere near her. Not only have I lost my darling mum, but I have now also lost my brother, who has chosen to support an individual who murdered his own mother rather than cooperate with the police's inquiry. I never accepted that this was an accident caused by my mum. My family and I have had to live with that knowledge and anguish of not knowing what really happened on the night of May 28th, 2018. Now we do, and I pray it gives us some closure." Tian and Darnton is of course still in prison to this day. I believe his minimum term of 15 years will come to an end, around 2023 time. That's when he could become eligible for parole, but I do really hope that the level of premeditation behind this crime is very much taken into account if he ever does come up for parole. I mean, having a kill list and making a floor plan of Mary's bungalow in order to carefully plan this crime is just one of the most terrifying things I've ever heard, and for me just highlights how extremely dangerous Tian and Darnton is as an individual, how much of a risk he poses. But yeah, that concludes this case. That is the heartbreaking case of Mary Gregory and the truth or dare killer, as he was dubbed by the media, Tiernan Darnton. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on this case down below in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think. And also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can pop them in the comments below, or alternatively you can go through my case request form, which is always linked in the description box of every single one of my videos. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie.